what are the best settings for this monitor. And by best settings, I mean the settings I adopted as my test settings in the review. These kept my colorimeter happy, going for the usual targets I do in my reviews, so that's a 6500K white point, 2.2 gamma tracking or close to these values as I can get, with reasonable adjustments. And it worked on my unit and satisfied my preferences. Everyone's unit will be different, everyone will have their own preferences. So the first thing to consider is the gaming mode setting. That's found in the game setting part of the menu. I'd advise keeping this set to standard, Gamer 1, Gamer 2 or Gamer 3. The FPS and RTS modes, and racing as well, they just give a really funky, oversaturated, weird look to the image. You might like that look, in which case feel free to use them, but it certainly isn't accurate and it doesn't give you the optimum shade variety on the monitor. The standard setting also unlocks a setting which some will definitely consider a best setting. That's found in Picture, and that is Color Space. So if you have that set to panel native, it uses the full native gamut of the monitor, you get the full saturation levels, and that will give you oversaturation to most standard content, which is created with the sRGB color space in mind. If you select the sRGB setting, that's an sRGB emulation setting which clamps the gamut closer to sRGB. With this active, you can adjust the brightness, but a lot of your other settings are grayed out. In addition to giving an image which is more muted and more appropriate within the constraints of the sRGB color space, and some may indeed prefer this look, using sRGB emulation can also speed up some pixel responses. It doesn't do this universally, and it very much depends on the content as to whether you'll actually notice this or whether this will be an advantage for you. So the image here is a pursuit photograph using Test UFO, and this is using Windows ACM Auto Color Management, which is an alternative method of achieving sRGB emulation. And with this, you can just keep the monitor in your regular settings, which I would use for my test settings, for example, which gives you full control, so you're not using the sRGB setting of the monitor, you're instead doing it at the GPU level. If you want to learn more about this alternative means of sRGB emulation, check out the article linked to in the video description. But anyway, what you can see is for the particular transition shown here, it does speed things up. The reason for that is that it makes the transitions less extreme. The UFO has very saturated yellow and pure red, which is very saturated. But when you use ACM or you use the sRGB setting of the monitor or use alternative sRGB emulation, the saturation levels are curtailed and the transition being performed is changed, so they're actually between closer values. Now be aware that a lot of the transitions you'll see on this monitor which are quite slow will be with black or near black shades. Those ones aren't actually changed, and grayscale shades more generally aren't changed in the same way as these very saturated colours will be. So when you're gaming, you'll see a lot of transitions which aren't actually affected by using sRGB emulation or not, but depending on the content you're viewing, you may well notice some improvement. So yeah, that's a neat little trick, which applies in general to wide gamut VA models, not just this one, something I've noticed before. I'm going to have the colour space set to panel native because I like to use the full native gamut of the monitor, and then I explore the sRGB capabilities separately. So this is just how I set things up in my test settings and how I like to do things when I review. I set the brightness to 54, which got close to my usual 160 nit target, which I go for in my reviews for consistency. It also suits my own preferences and lighting environment, but please do adjust this brightness according to your own preferences and lighting environment. Anything I'm not mentioning here, by the way, such as contrast, I left all of this at the default values with the standard setting. I also had Adaptive Sync enabled because I like to use VRR, Variable Refresh Rate technologies. You can use NVIDIA G-Sync compatible, or you can use AMD FreeSync using this setting. The other thing is I have color temp set to user, and with that you can access the red, green and blue color channels. Red I left at the default of 50, green I lowered slightly to 49, blue to 46. This got a good neutral green channel on my unit with close to the 6500K white point target. Be aware that individual units do vary in this respect. We'll also briefly mention this might be a best setting for some people. If you like a more relaxing viewing experience, you might like to use the low blue mode setting, which will reduce your blue channel, but it also gives you quite a strong green channel. So it gives a warm but greenish yellow tint to the image. Reading is the strongest setting, incidentally. There are various other ways you could achieve this if you want a more neutral look to things, or you want to achieve a low blue mode without the green tint, and that would be, for example, using the Windows nightlight setting. So that's all I changed. Gamer mode set to standard, although you could use Gamer 1, Gamer 2 or Gamer 3. Adaptive Sync on, brightness at 54, color temp set to user, green channel lowered to 49, blue lowered to 46, red left at 50. Oh, and I forgot to mention, there is an overdrive setting, very important on this monitor. I've just been using OLEDs so much recently that I kind of forgot about this setting as a best setting. It definitely is a best setting. I'd recommend setting this to faster. This is all explored in more detail in the review. And I also explore MBR and MBR sync there. I'm now going to enable HDR in Windows and talk about the HDR settings. This section is going to be pretty quick because, as I explore in the review, HDR on this monitor is really not good at all. In fact, it's pretty terrible. There's also not a lot you can configure of note in the menu. You can use VRR at the same time as HDR if you wish, so adaptive sync is still available for you. It's really just this HDR setting which you have to pay attention to. When you use the default setting, display HDR, things are noticeably washed out. There's obvious undersaturation, and things really look like you're using SDR, but you're using a gamma setting which gives really low gamma, so things just really washed out, and also it looks like you've restricted the colour gamut too much. Things have improved a bit using HDR picture, but there's now sort of a strange mixture of some oversaturated elements with some undersaturated elements, and there's still this generally foggy look as if the gamma's too low. So because this is HDR, it would technically be as if the PQ EOTF tracking is completely off. HDR movie, really that mainly just ramps up the saturation levels, so the oversaturated elements become really quite funky looking, like the greens of the tree here, for example. And things just look really unbalanced and a bit messy. Again, some elements appear really undersaturated, like some of these clay colours, for example, and also the earthy tones. The game setting, that just ramps the saturation up further for those oversaturated elements, while some elements still look undersaturated. So basically the gamut isn't used properly, the gamma isn't configured correctly, or the EOTF PQ curve isn't calibrated correctly. So no matter what you do on the monitor, at least as far as my unit was calibrated, HDR always looks a bit messy. So if you have to use HDR on the monitor, I'd actually generally just recommend using SDR, but if you are using HDR, I'd recommend setting that to HDR picture. At least that worked on my unit and according to my preferences here, but I don't really like how it looks either way. Now, I'm not going to go through this in the video, but if you wanted to fine-tune things and you were using a PC, your best bet might actually be display HDR, lower the gamma in NVIDIA control panel, and then use Windows HDR calibration and ramp up the saturation all the way there. With that, you might get a better look to things under HDR in general, but really the HDR capabilities physically in terms of the hardware, this monitor is not meant for HDR. It doesn't give you a proper HDR experience, even if you tweak everything to your liking. I really don't see much point in using HDR over SDR, except that it just gives a different look to things. So in general, my advice is just stick to SDR on this monitor. I'm now on the Lagom Black Levels test, lagom.nl. I'm just going to explore some visibility enhancement you can do on this monitor if you want to make things more visible in dark areas of your games, for example. Dark Boost is the main setting on this one. You can set that to level 1, which gives you a bit of a boost, level 2 more of a boost, level 3 the strongest boost. What I would say though is, yeah, it is quite effective in boosting up these dark shades, and it doesn't affect your black depth, which I like to see, so you don't lose contrast. But the very dark shades actually aren't boosted up as much as you might like. If you want to boost them up a little bit more, I would stick to level 3 for dark boost, but then also adjust your gamma setting on the monitor. And you want to lower that, so have that set to 1.8. And with this combination, that will give you the best visibility for these dark shades. Just be aware that what you can see on the video is not exactly what you see by eye, but it does give you an idea of the relative change these settings will make. And finally, I'd just like to point out the monitor does have an on-screen crosshair called dial point. If you have that set to on, then it gives you this little red cross in the middle of the screen. You can't change the position of the crosshair, by the way, or the design, or the colour. Well, you can kind of change the colour, and that would simply be if you change to the dynamic dial point. And that means it will change colour to try and contrast with the background. So it's black here to contrast with very light background, but now it's gone green to contrast with that background, red to contrast with that one. You get the idea. It tries to enhance its visibility, changing with the background shade. If you press the third button along without being in the main menu, you can also cycle between the dial point being on, set the dynamic setting, or off. So if you find the dial point is on the screen and you don't want it there, you don't know how you've done that, then just press the third button until it disappears.